Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Lives, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I am Barney Schifferout from Wausau, Wisconsin, and I'm a junior studying biology in the College of Letters and Science. Today, we will be hearing from Steve Ackerman, who is the Vice Chancellor for Research and Graduate Education and is also a professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences. Steve will be talking about one of America's most famous maritime disasters, the USS Edmund Fitzgerald. Steve Ackerman is an expert in the area of satellite meteorology, a field largely invented at UW-Madison. He is the recipient of a NASA Exceptional Public Service Medal and the Dorothy Howard Prize for Folklore Education for his work on the website and project Wisconsin Weather Stories. Steve co-authors the popular Ask the Weather Guys column in the Wisconsin State Journal, where you may have heard him as a frequent guest on Wisconsin Public Radio. Please welcome Steve Ackerman.
All right. Thank you, Barney, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining this presentation. Sorry it can't be face-to-face, but given these times, we make do with what we can. I trust that you are all trying to be safe and take care of yourselves during these difficult times. This is a very mysterious and controversial shipwreck that was certainly immortalized by the folk singer Gordon Lightfoot. And so we'll be talking about that today. The way that I would like to talk a bit about it is to first talk an overview, just a small bit about the ship, then give you some little information about the storm, and then a little information about the song. And then we're going to go to basically November 9th and 10th and look at the weather that was occurring at that time and what was happening to the ship during those 2 days. And then also look at how it was reflected in the song by Gordon Lightfoot. Again, this is a very interesting maritime disaster that is only, I think, surpassed in terms of shipwrecks by the sinking of the Titanic as well. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the ship. So the ship, the Edmund Fitzgerald, was sunk on November 10th, 1975, on Lake Superior. At the time, it was the worst shipping disaster on the Great Lakes in 11 years. While it's very interesting to talk about this mystery in terms of what caused the ship to go down, and it's also fun to hypothesize what had happened, it's also very important to remember that there were 29 lives lost during this disaster. And so as we go through this, I ask that you keep that in mind because, as I said, it's interesting for us to hypothesize about this disaster and what caused it, but to the lives and to the families of these crew members, this is a very devastating event. So a little bit more about the ship. The Edmund Fitzgerald, was named for the president of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, whose grandfather and all 5 of his grandfather's brothers were Great Lakes captains. The Edmund Fitzgerald was known as the pride of the American sides because it was so huge. It weighed over 13,000 tons, was 729 feet long, and when it got up ahead of steam, it could go 16 miles per hour. When it was launched on June 7th, 1958, there were about 15,000 people there to watch the launching of it. It set numerous records in terms of shipping, And one of those is that in 1964, it became the first ship on the Great Lakes to carry more than 1 million tons of iron ore through the Soo locks. The storm. During the 9th to the 10th of November 1975, an intense storm ravaged the upper Great Lakes regions with winds in excess of storm force winds on Lake Superior, and we'll define what that means in terms of miles per hour. This storm is known as a mid-latitude cyclone or an extratropical cyclone. Cyclones are low-pressure systems, and we call it mid-latitude or extratropical because it occurs in the latitudes where we live, which is the mid-latitudes. Mid-latitude storms are very common. We get them all the time in the fall and the winter. Unique about this storm is that it was a very intense storm, although not the only one of its kind. There were two very similar storms to this particular storm that sunk the Edmund Fitzgerald, the Armistice Day storm of 1940, and then a very similar storm in November in 1998. If we have some time, we'll come back and talk a little bit about these two storms. The storm in November 1998 was never named because no one died during that day. And the reason is that weather forecasting had gotten so much better. And then finally, a little bit about the song. In 1975, when the Edmund Fitzgerald went down, Lightfoot had read a Newsweek article about the loss of this ship. And then he started writing his song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It reached #2. It came out in 1976. It reached #2 on the United States Billboard chart and was a big hit in Canada as well. And if you listen to classic rock stations, you will still hear this song frequently played. So this ballad is a very popular ballad. So that's a little bit about the ship, the storm, and the song. Now let's look at how they integrate and how they work together as we look at these fateful days between November 9th and November 10th. Let's start with the beginning of the song, and feel free to sing along with this phrase. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down to the big lake they call Gitche Gumee. The lake, it is said, never gives up her dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With a load of iron ore, 26,000 tons more than the Edmund Fitzgerald weighed empty. So the song, the ballad about the Fitzgerald is actually pretty accurate in terms of representing what had happened during those fateful days. Just as we go through this, I'll point out every now and then some of the things that are just a little off. But in many cases, that's fine because we're giving the artist maybe a little bit of freeway as he writes his song. One of the things I want to point out, though, is that the Ojibwe call this lake Gitche Gumee, that means be a great sea. Longfellow, when he wrote the Song of Hiawatha, wrote it as Gitche Gumee. And so that phrase, that translation has seemed to be carried across, but it's the wrong translation, according to the Ojibwe. Also of very interest is that the lake never gives up her dead. The Lake Superior waters, if you've ever been up there in this time of year, and in the 1970s, the water temperature was typically less than 36 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty close to freezing, just being above freezing. Normally, when a body drowns, it begins to decay. The bacteria cause that decay, bloat the body with gas. And it's that gas that causes the body to float to the surface after a few days. With such cold water, that biological bacterial activity doesn't occur. And so the bodies don't float up to the surface, and that's why the lake doesn't give up its dead. 26,000 tons of ore. They're actually in the form of Talconite pellets. And you can see the photo there is a handful of these Talconite pellets. That's what they look like. They're essentially little round iron marbles, which means they roll. And in fact, that's how they end up loading the ship. Again, back to the song, the ship was the pride of the American side. As I mentioned earlier, that's what it was called. Coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. As big freighters go, it was bigger than most. When it was launched, it was the biggest, largest ship on North America's Great Lakes. And she remains the largest ship to have actually sunk on the Great Lakes. Concluding some terms with a couple of steel firms when they left fully loaded for Cleveland. Actually, they weren't headed towards Cleveland. The end result of these iron ore pallets was Detroit. This is the path that the Edmund Fitzgerald took. And I'm going to see if I can get my pointer options up to kind of help point it out. So this is the path of the ship. And then the dot down here is where it sank. If you look at this path, you might think, well, that was a long way to go. It seems like it could have been a lot shorter if they would have gone to between Standard Rock and Caribou Island. We're going to talk about why they took this particular path as we go through the weather events that were happening during this time. So turning to the weather, let's look at day one, which we'll talk as the birth of the extratropical cyclone or mid-latitude cyclone. So this is how the storm started. This is actually what the map looked like on 6 a.m. Central Time or 7 a.m. Eastern Time on November 8th, 1975. Many of you are probably familiar with these blue lines with the blue triangles. They represent cold fronts. This purple line with the alternating purple triangles and half moons are what we call an occluded front. They're usually occur during the mature phase of the storm and then as it begins to die down. The shaded areas represent where it's precipitating. So you could see on November 8th, there's not much precipitation going on across the US here. In fact, it's actually a pretty nice day. Of concern for this particular weather event is what's going down here in Colorado, that little insignificant low pressure system. Also, I want to mention that these thin blue lines represent the surface pressure. And basically, the more packed together they are, the higher the wind speed. And the more spread out they are, the weaker the wind speed is. So we're going to be tracking, and I can assure you the National Weather Service during these 2 days is beginning to track this low pressure system in southwest Colorado. As the song is saying, that good ship and crew was a bone to be chewed when the gales of November came early. And what he's doing here is foretelling in the song what is to come. Now, this isn't necessarily an early storm so much. In fact, if we look at climatology, these two dark blue areas in the fall is where we tend to get typical regions of cyclogenesis, which means this is where the storms begin to develop. So it's right here in the Four Corners here in the panhandle of Oklahoma is one region in the fall where these mid-latitude storms begin to develop and intensify. And the black lines here show the path that they typically take once they begin to form. So in the fall, it's not uncommon where the skies are going to turn gloomy in the Midwest, because once these storms develop, they typically head right towards the Great Lake regions. We tend to call these a panhandle hooker because it hooks down and then heads up. These are other storms that start off in Canada, in Alberta, and we tend to call them Alberta clippers, those storms, because they really just clip the US and they're traveling really fast, much faster typically than these panhandle hook storms. This dotted line represents sort of a second path of these storms that develop in the southeast quadrant, if you will, of Colorado. So it's not atypical to get these storms in November, for sure. Day 2 with the Fitz. So that was how things were beginning to develop on November 8th, beautiful day. Early Sunday morning on November 9th, in Duluth Superior docks, the Edmund Fitzgerald is being loaded with those iron ore pellets, 26,000 pounds, enough to make 7,500 automobiles. And if you think back in the 1970s, automobiles were pretty heavy. So that is a lot of iron ore. Because they're in these Talconite pellets, the way that they load the ship is they basically slide the pellets down these huge chutes, just like marbles. And then they load them into the hatchways, and then the crew will come and seal, anchor down the hatch covers for each of those. And then shortly before 2 p.m. on November 9th, the Edmund Fitzgerald departs on the open waters of Lake Superior. Back to the weather. This is what the surface weather map looks like on November 9th, 1975 at 6 a.m. Central Time. Again, blue lines represent the cold fronts. Now what we're seeing also is this warm front, the red line with the red half moons, and we're getting a very low pressure system developing. So what we're seeing here on the morning at 7 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time, November 9th, is this storm that was over here in the panhandle of Oklahoma has begun to develop, to deepen. We now have a very well structured cold front tied to its warm front. This is the classic look of a mid-latitude cyclone as it begins to develop. And climatologically, and this is what the National Weather Service is forecasting for this low, is to head right towards the Great Lake regions. Again, the shaded regions are now showing where precipitation is occurring. So you can see the precipitation is occurring out in front of the warm front as it's heading northward. So that cyclone that was just east of the Rockies is now developed and is moving towards the Great Lakes region. November 9th, along with the Fitzgerald is another ship called the Anderson, and its captain, Bernie Cooper, will recall years later, he had been interviewed multiple times about what had happened on the day that the Edmund Fitzgerald sank. And he said it was one of those special days on Lake Superior with just ripples on the water, sunny and warm for November. As they departed, they could see the Edmund Fitzgerald. And indeed, those two ships decided to sail together as they were headed towards Sault Ste. Marie. So it started out as a beautiful day. As was mentioned early by Barney, Wisconsin is the birthplace of weather satellite. So I'm obliged to show a very rare satellite image. Back in the 1970s, this was just the beginning of the satellite era. And so we were fortunate enough to find this particular satellite imagery on November 9th, 1975. Again, you can see the cold front. You can see the warm front up here, the red line. This is a classic structure of a developing cyclone. It looks like a comma in terms of the cloud structure. You have the comma head where it's precipitating out in front of the low, and then the comma tail is associated with cloudiness out in front of the cold front. Then you have this dry slot, which air is coming down from below and descending, and very rapid air causing high velocity air down at the surface. So this is what it looked like, a rather unique satellite image. Of course, as the storm is developing, the National Weather Service is monitoring it. They expect it to be developing into a storm system. Again, remember, this is 45 years ago. And so the instrumentations, the computers that we have today were certainly not available to the forecasters during that time period. Nonetheless, the forecast for November 9th at 7 p.m., again, Eastern time, was issued by the National Weather Service, and they were forecasting gale warning for Lake Superior, which means the winds over the lake are going to be on the order of 40 to 46 miles per hour. So pretty strong winds. They also predicted that the winds would be coming from the east or the northeast, shifting to the northwest or north by the afternoon of November 10th. So that forecast of the wind direction, we'll see, is pretty important in terms of why the ship captains, the two ship captains, changed their route. At about 2 a.m. on November 10th, the National Weather Service upgraded the gale warnings to a storm warning, which meant that the winds were going to be between 55 and 63 miles per hour. Again, prediction of the northeast at 45 to 57 miles per hour, becoming northwesterly, 32 to 45 miles per hour, predicting wave heights of 8 to 15 feet. So given that forecast, the captains of the Anderson and the Fitzgerald are also looking at their own weather information, their own maps, and they're discussing the threatening weather, and they decided to change their route to a more northerly direction along Ontario's North Shore. So why do that? Well, if they take this path along the Ontario's northern shore, if the wind is going to be coming out of the northeast or the north, then they're going to be protected a bit from the wind by the land. So they won't have a lot of open water between themselves and where the wind is blowing. And as we'll see, that open water is going to determine how high the waves will become. You might also recognize, if you haven't been out on the water, that one of the things that determines wind speed is the type of surface the wind is blowing over because of friction. So when you're over land, the winds are typically less. And then when it moves over the water, the wind speeds pick up because friction drops a bunch. So by going closer to the shoreline, they'll be protected more from the large wind speeds that'll be coming from the northeast or north, at least as it was predicted. Of course, this is a developing storm, so the National Weather Service is monitoring it very carefully. And at 3 a.m. on November 10th, the winds are reported as coming from the northeast at 42 knots, which is like 48 miles per hour. And the Fitzgerald and the Anderson proceed together. They're traveling together. The Fitzgerald is slightly ahead of the Anderson. They have radio contact, and the Anderson's radar can locate the position of where the Fitzgerald is. At 7 a.m., the storm passed over Marquette, Michigan, and starts across Lake Superior. What does the weather map look like on November 10th at 7 a.m. Eastern time? Well, the first thing you notice is, again, a very developed system. You got your cold front, you got your warm front, and now the occluded front, the purple lines, have now developed, indicating that the storm is reaching its maximum intensification. And again, the pressure lines, the blue lines, they're packed very tightly together, which is an indication that the winds at the surface are really, really strong. And if we go to the song, and late that night when the ship bell rang, could it be the north wind they've been feeling? So again, what Gordon Lightfoot is foretelling here is that there was a wind shift, and the wind seems to be coming from a direction that initially was not predicted. So before I give you a little information about this chart, I want to remind us that long before we had computers and apps on our smartphones, we needed weather forecasts, particularly farmers and sailors. They needed to know if storms were approaching, and so they can plan for them. Over the years, before the modern era, in order to develop forecasting, they became known as folklore forecasts in the form of short rhymes, and they were designed in order to pass down through the generations so that they could be memorable and in many cases often accurate as well. So here's one folklore forecast. Fast rise after low foretells a stronger blow. And this saying is at least as old as the 19th century. So in the 1800s, British meteorologist Admiral Fitzgerald, captain of the Beagle, used this expression in his forecast. And what it does is when they say low, they mean a low pressure system. And of course, when they say stronger blow, they mean a stronger wind. So this forecast by folklore is actually pretty accurate in terms of what happens. And we can see that in this figure. So on the x-axis, we have day and time. So starting at midnight on November 9th, going to 11/12, November 10th, out to November 11th, out to midnight. And on the right-hand side, we have sea level pressure. And then the different colors represent the different observations that were being made at different stations. And then the dotted line here represents the time at which it was estimated that the Edmund Fitzgerald sank. And so you can see as the storm is approaching, the pressure rapidly drops. And then when the storm gets to you is when you reach your minimum pressure. And if we look at the Marquette, Michigan in particular, you can see it drops, you reach the low, and then the pressure rapidly rises. And what the folklore forecast is going to tell us is that the wind speeds are going to rapidly pick up. And we can see that in this further analysis. Looking at the top chart, we're looking at Sault Ste. Marie, the wind speed in knots on the y-axis. And on the left, we're looking at the pressure, again in millibars. Pressure is in blue, wind speed is in black. And then the bottom chart is showing Marquette, Michigan, where again, pressure is in red and wind speed again is in black here. And so you can see as the pressure rapidly increases, if we look at Marquette here, the red line, you can see that the wind speed really picks up and gets on the order of almost 20, 30 knots, which is getting close to 40 miles per hour. The triangles here are represented measured wind gusts. And as the song is saying, when the gales of November come slashing, when afternoon came, it was freezing rain in the face of a hurricane west wind. So not quite hurricane. The gusts were getting up to 62 knots. To be a Category 1 hurricane, you need to have sustained winds of at least 64 knots. So it's approaching it, but not quite there. And while there was no evidence that there was freezing rain occurring, nonetheless, it kind of fits in with the rhyming of the ballad pretty nicely. All right, on the afternoon of November 10th, a wind shift is clearly evident. So at 2:45 p.m., the winds have backed or gone counterclockwise and are now from the northwest to the west, winds at 42 knots. Steady winds of 43 knots of 49 miles per hour, and waves are being measured of up to 12 to 16 feet, as reported by the Anderson. At around 3:30 p.m., the Fitzgerald contacts the Anderson and reports they have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. And a list means that the boat is tilted, if you will, as it's going on its way, which is usually an indication that it may be taking on some water. Also at this time, the storm is so strong it actually closed the Sault Ste. Marie locks. Of course, the song is representing this pretty well. The wind in the wires made a tattletale sound. Again, indicating what is going on here. The winds are now coming from a direction that was not expected when they changed their route. And a wave broke over the railing, causing the fence rail to be lost. So why is it so important that the wind shift was occurring? A shift in the winds from the west to the northwest is important because it increases the fetch along the lake. So now the wind is now coming from here, the ships are around here. So instead of being protected by the land, they're now in the full brunt of the wind's force. And this is a picture of the Sault Ste. Marie locks to give you an indication of the roughness of the water that's occurring near Whitefish Bay. So now the winds have all of this water, open water, to blow over. And that's going to be important because that's going to help determine how big the waves are. So the size of a wave that is generated by the wind is a function of 3 things. One is the wind speed. The stronger the wind, the larger the force on the water, and therefore the bigger the wave. And it has to be a constant wind. And if you think back to that chart of wind speed with Marquette, we had 40-mile-per-hour winds going for a couple of hours. So very constant, strong winds. And that's the other part, the duration. The longer the wind blows over the water, the larger the waves. And then the third part is the fetch. And that's the distance of open water. The bigger the fetch, the larger the waves. And we can calculate a relationship between wind speed, duration, and the size of the waves by assuming that the fetch is infinite. So it's like blowing over the ocean, if you will. And so this plot is showing you the maximum wave height as a function of wind speed, assuming that it's pure open water, there's no land going on. So you can see a 40-knot wind, which is about 46 miles per hour, which is what was being observed. Theoretically, could get you a wind of greater, could get a wave height of greater than 35 feet. These X's here represent some of the ship observations on November 10th that were made of the height of the waves. And you can see they were getting greater than 20 feet in height. Again, the song is pointing out when supper time came, the old cook came on deck saying, "Fellas, it's too rough to feed you." No surprise there if you're in 20-foot waves that it would be kind of rough to feed you. Continuing with the song, again in its sequence, at 7 p.m. a main hatchway caved in. He said, and referring to the cook, "Fellas, it's been good to know you." The captain wired in, he had water coming in and the good ship and crew was in peril. And later that night, when its lights went out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So while the phrase of this song is very romantic, it makes it sound like the crew and the captain knew they were doomed. And in reality, that is certainly not the case. The captain had suspected that water was coming in. That's why he had a list. And as we'll see in the next couple of slides, he also had his pumps running. So he suspected that there may be waves coming in, water getting in. But the sinking of the Fitzgerald, as we'll see, was just way too rapid. And it's likely that they did not know the seriousness of the condition that they were in just prior to the sinking of the ship. Gordon Lightfoot in 2010 changed the lyrics a bit. Initially, it was 7 p.m. the main hatchway caved in. He said, fellas, it's been good to know you. In 2010, he changed that to at 7 p.m. it grew dark. It was then he said, fellas, it's been good to know you. The big mystery is how, if water was getting into the ship, and we're pretty sure that it was, how was it getting into the ship? Initially, the Marine Transportation Safety Board thought that the water was getting in through the hatchways, so the hatch covers where the Talconite pellets were being loaded into. There was no real clear evidence of that. In addition, there was also some suggestion that if that was the case, that people could blame the sailors on the ships for not securing it. Gordon Lightfoot never really liked that idea of, trying to put blame on it. When it became clear that it was unknown what really was the cause for the ship taking on water, he decided to change the words and not imply that it might have been the hatchways, and just changed it to "it grew dark." So around 3:02 p.m., McSorley, who is the captain of the Fitzgerald, calls Cooper on the radio, saying, Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I've sustained some topside damage, indicated that earlier. I have a fence rail laid down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking, which means he's slowing down, and he asked the Anderson to stay with them until they get Whitefish Bay. Charlie on that replies, Cooper, do you have your pumps going? Yes, both of them is the reply. So again, the Fitzgerald thinks they're taking on water. They're running their pumps to get water out that may be coming into the ship. At around 4:10 p.m., the windstorm is continuing to intensify, and it blows off the Fitzgerald's radar antenna and also knocks out power to the remote navigation station at Whitefish Bay. So this is a really nasty storm. Also at 5 p.m., the lighthouse at Standard Rock, north of Marquette, the closest observing station, records a wind gust of 76 miles per hour. Cooper on the Anderson estimated wind gusts of more than 100 miles per hour. At 6 p.m., McSorley talks to another ship captain. There are more than these 2 ships on Lake Superior at the time. And on the radio, he says, I have a bad list, lost both radars, and I'm taking heavy seas over the deck. One of the worst seas I've ever been in. Again, while they're very nasty seas with 20-foot waves, as far as I know, he's the only captain saying that this is one of the worst seas that he's ever been in. And we'll talk about why he may be having that perspective in just a minute. The Anderson is 10 miles behind her, the Fitzgerald, so they're still keeping in contact. So with regard to what's going on, I want to show this little video. So here I have a pile of sand, and if I were to gently pour some water on here, you can see it doesn't roll off the table. It fills the spaces between the sand grains. So this is an important demonstration, I think, because while the Fitzgerald is not carrying sand, it's carrying Talconite pellets, these round marble-like iron ore pellets with lots of airspace between them. So if water is getting into the bays where that pellets are being stored, the water, like with the sand, is filling up that space and not escaping out where the pumps could then pump it out. So water is being taken on and filling up those air spaces rather than being in spaces where pumps can rapidly move them out of the way. At 7:10 p.m., the Anderson gives navigation to the Fitzgerald. Up ahead of it, he asked him again, oh, by the way, how are you holding up? And the Fitzgerald replies, we're holding our own. Again, contrary to the song, which makes it sound like they knew they were going down right away. It's clear they did not know the severe damage that they were taking on. Immediately after this conversation, a severe snow squall enshrouds the two boats, and the Fitzgerald is hidden from the radar beam. Again, radars in the 1970s were nothing like they are today, and so they can't penetrate through that snow squall. And so they can't see them, and they're not surprised by that. But just as suddenly, around 7:30, the snow ends and it clears out, and visibility is excellent. And unfortunately, the lights from the ships, from other ships, while they can be seen, the lights from the Fitzgerald cannot be seen. In addition, the radar blips on the Anderson's radar screen don't show anything. And when they try to raise the Fitzgerald on radar, they can't get radar contact either. So the captain of the Anderson is searching for the Fitzgerald. I mean, how do you lose a 729-foot ore freighter in the middle of the lake? He did call the U.S. Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie with his worst fears, and there's a quote from his discussion. This is the Anderson. "I am very concerned with the welfare of the steamer Edmund Fitzgerald. Can't see any lights, and he doesn't have them on his radar. He just hopes that he didn't take a nosedive." What we do know is that the Anderson is gone. There was some things recovered, and two of those things were lifeboats. And again, you can see these from these photos that the damage of the lifeboats, in fact, in one of them, only half of the lifeboat was found, was really severe, indicating that they were just ripped off of their storage holds on the boat. Again, that coupled with the fact that there was no distress signals ever issued suggests that, again, the ship went down. They did not know how rapidly they were going down. And so getting towards the end of the song here, does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? The searchers all say they would have made Whitefish Bay if they put 15 more miles behind them. If you look at what was happening at Whitefish Bay, they might have made it there, but again, what would have happened? The weather there was pretty bad as well. In fact, the highest waves were being occurred in that region, which is no surprise given that the winds were coming from the northwest and had the full fetch of Lake Superior to generate its big waves. But as the song is saying, it's getting to that question of what caused them to break. They might have split up, or they might have capsized. They may have broke deep and took water. And so what he's saying in this song in 1976 is, what went down? And it's still a mystery of what made it sink, but there is a couple of theories that brought it down. The Marine Casualty Report, as I mentioned earlier, did come up with its theories. They thought water was coming through the hatchways, but again, there are no survivors or witnesses, right? So it's only based on testimonies and underwater surveys of the wreck. I think what we do know consistently is that the Fitzgerald was taking on water. How it was taking it on or why it was taking it on is still a big mystery, but the water is coming in. And then at around 7:15, it went plunged into a large wave, and that caused it to sink abruptly. And we'll talk about how that might have happened. Of course, again, there are a lot of different theories about how water might have been getting on through the hatch covers. Maybe they bottomed out at 6 fathoms shoal. That was a theory for a while. Might have been stress factors, might have been a rogue wave. There's problems with each one of these theories. What caused the ship to go down, in my mind, was very clear. It was the weather. That's what sunk the ship. If it would have been a beautiful day or stayed a beautiful day, the ship wouldn't have gone down. Now, I want to show one more demonstration as I begin to conclude about what I think happened. So here's my little demonstration. On this plank here, I have a bunch of little handful of Talconite pellets. So imagine them moving along and then stopping. They go forward, they roll. So you can imagine that as the ship is going, loaded up with these Talconite pellets, it's taking on water, it's filling the air spaces. Then when it hits a big wave, it sort of slows down. And when it slows down, just like in that demonstration, all those pellets move to the bow of the ship. And that's going to cause the bow to rapidly nosedive downwards, the stern to pop up, and the ship to break apart. These is two sketches from an exploration of the shipwreck in 1977 by the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Casualty Report. One of the things they take away from this is that if you look at the bow, there was a lot of severe damage in the bow of the ship, indicating that it hit the bottom nose first really hard. So again, would be consistent with the bow going down. It's currently in 530 feet of water. Again, it's been ripped apart. This is the stern part of the ship. You notice you can see the bottom, and there's no evidence looking at the bottom that actually it bottomed out anywhere and took on damage that way. This is another sketch of it. Here's the bow part and here's the stern part. So you can see they're separated out. On the right here are different expeditions that went down to look at the ship to try and figure out what had happened. This circle region is the approximate area of the wreckage. A lot of these Talconite pellets are scattered around this area, which again suggests that the ship broke apart near the surface based on the distribution of that wreckage, and then sank afterwards. In a musty old hall in Detroit, they prayed. In the Maritime Sailors Cathedral, the church bell chimed till it rang 29 times for each man on the Edmund Fitzgerald. And so there's no doubt in my mind that this legend will live on from the Chippewa on down of the big leak they called Gitchigumi, again, a misrepresentation of that phrase. They did pull the bell up. This is a photo of the bell from the Edmund Fitzgerald. And on November 10th, they will again go and ring the bell the 29 times for the lives of the 29 sailors that were on the ship when it went down. And again, I put this up because there is always going to be another extratropical cyclone. There's always going to be another one as severe as this one, as the one we saw in 1940, as the one we saw in 1998. And there'll be another Ballard at some point that'll be just as catchy a tune. But people are unique and irreplaceable, and their loss will be felt forever. I want to end by just talking a little bit about the changes. So after a disaster like this, of course, they're going to look at what can be done in order to make transportation more safe. And so in this, they did lead to changes in shipping regulations, which included mandatory survival suits, depth finders, positioning systems, increased freeboard in the ships, as well as more frequent inspections of the vessels. So that's my little interpretation of what went on with the Edmund Fitzgerald, the ship, the storm, and the song. And if we have some time for questions, I'd be happy to take a couple.
Hi, everyone. Fran Paleo-Moyer here, Badger Talks producer. Steve, thanks so much for sharing that story with us. I know you've taken time out of your busy schedule to present your talk several times around the state. And I have to say, every time you have a large crowd, and you're not failing today. We've got a lot of viewers online. And we did have a couple of questions posted. Ann Dawes Alt asked, do they know prior to leaving that the cyclone would be a factor on their trip?
They knew that there was a storm developing, but they did not know how severe it was. So they were leaving the morning of the 9th. They knew there would be a storm, but initially the National Weather Service was not forecasting such an intense storm until later in the day. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Michael Sherman asks, why did the ships not travel through the Upper Peninsula between Houghton and Hancock?
That's a good question. Again, I think they changed, well, I know they changed their route in order to try and be more protected from the storm. Why they took that particular route, other than being buffered better by the winds, I'm wondering if it was more of a traditional route for these big freighters to take. A lot of times it's just, you take this path or you take that path. You don't take anything in between. I don't know. That's a good question.
Thank you. Let's see. Alan Poulin is asking, what is freeboard? Did you reference something called freeboard?
Yeah, that's at the end, and that's related to how, if you will, how the ship floats in the water, how heavy it could be. And the thing with the Edmund Fitzgerald is, as it was taking on water and going into those pellets, it was taking on more and more. I forgot to mention this, and therefore getting heavier and heavier, and therefore getting lower and lower. And that's why the 20-foot waves look like the biggest thing it had ever seen, because he was lower in the water than he normally would be had he not been taken on water.
Wow, so many factors at play there.
Yeah.
Let's see, Don Cameron is asking, have you read the book Requiem for the Toledo Express?
Yes, I did a number of years ago. Yep. In fact, I have it on my bookshelf someplace.
Let's see, a nice little limerick here by Greg Kramer. What I really want to know is this: was there a red sky that morning so the sailors had warning?
Oh, that's an interesting, that folklore is also generally pretty good. It's telling you where clouds are, and I'll bet not so, just because the storm was developing further to the south and not so much to the west or the east of where they were.
Oh, great.
Yeah. But good question.
Elaine Williams Carnes is asking, do you feel the body that was found by the wreckage sometime later had anything to do with the Edmund Fitzgerald?
Yeah, they did at one of those later surveys find a body down by the ship. And actually that person did have on a lifeboat, a life jacket as well. Wouldn't surprise me that they all had life jackets on in 20-foot seas just for safety. And I'm pretty certain they thought that body was, or they think that body was associated with the Edmund Fitzgerald. But clearly they left it down there. They didn't bring it up.
Thank you. We have a comment by Donna Left. This is absolutely fascinating. I have a family friend who was a student at UW Superior when the Fitzgerald sank. I was interested to listen to his recollection too. And we've had a few other comments that either had family or friends somehow related to this disaster. Another question by Betty Smith McKnight. Have you or are you doing any more talks on other shipwrecks?
I have not. I've read books on other shipwrecks because there are some really interesting ones. And there is some weather events. The 1940 storm took down a bunch of ships as well. I think the interest in this one is the ship that went down, the Edmund Fitzgerald, was so big. It was a very interesting storm. We had better observations now than we did in 1940. And of course, we have the ballad as well to talk about it.
Well, thank you so much. And there's many thank yous coming out on Facebook. So everybody, thanks for tuning in today. And Steve, again, thanks for taking the time to, this is still obviously shrouded in mystery and interest for everyone, but thanks for sort of breaking through a little bit of that mystery for us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. I enjoyed talking about it, and it's unfortunate we can't be there together because a lot of times, as you pointed out, there are people who have had experiences with it or family members who have
Yeah.
actually seen the ship, which I haven't. And it's always interesting to hear their stories as well.
I hear one quick post by Jessica Roth Landon. My dad was on a freighter that searched for the Fitzgerald after the waters calmed down. So yeah, those personal connections are great. And thanks for sharing those, everybody. And everybody, thanks for tuning in. We had visitors from all over the country today. So that was nice. Of course, we always appreciate our Wisconsin viewership too. Thanks again, Steve. Everybody, please tune in next Tuesday, November 10th. We're going to be talking to Yoral Lashley of the UW Arts Collaboratory, and he's going to be talking a little bit about art making opportunities for youth and how that cultivates wellness and advocates for social change. He'll be talking about a lot of the programs that they're doing there in the Arts Collaboratory, so please tune in. Feel free to sign up for email updates and learn about upcoming talks before anybody else. You can sign up for the email list at badgertalks.wisc.edu. And thanks so much for tuning in. Take care, everybody.